Welcome everyone. Welcome to this Social Science Week event. Christianity, Disability and Indigeneity. What do these mean for person-directed practice, policies and politics in plural Australia? It's great to have you all here. Thank you for joining us. My name's Mark Short. I'm Bishop of the Anglican Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn, and you'll meet a variety of presenters and panellists during our time together. If you could kindly keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. If you do wish to share a question for one of the presenters, you're welcome to use the chat box. I'm now going to pass across to Auntie Kathy Naden, Arabana woman, and one of our panellists who's going to do the acknowledgement of country.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. As Mark said, I'm an Arabana woman from South Australia. I also have family connections to Yugundjara, Indigenity and Aranda people as well. So just before I do the acknowledgement, I'd like for each of us to think about country and actually what that means to you. For Aboriginal people, it is a place of connection and belonging to family, to community and culture. It is also our life source. There's bush tucker, bush medicine, and our waters, the rivers and the seas are so important. It is a place we can go and sit, reflect and listen. It is also a place of learning and healing, and it is God-given. As Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have never ever ceded our rights to this country, Australia, and the challenge remains to do better as Australians, to care for country and for each other. Today I'd like to use the Bush Church Aid Society's acknowledgement of country that was put together by their Indigenous Ministry Committee in 2018. We acknowledge the triune God, the creator of heaven and earth, and his ownership of all things. We recognise that he gave stewardship of these lands upon which we meet to the First Nations people of this country, Australia. In his sovereignty, he has allowed other people groups to migrate to these shores. We acknowledge the cultures of our First Nations people and are thankful for the community that we share together now, even virtually. We pay our respects to our First Nations elders and leaders, both past and present, and to those who are rising up to become leaders. We would also like to acknowledge other cultural groups who are participating in the forum today. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll now pass over to my co-chair, Bishop Stephen Pickard from the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture.
Just while we're handing over, can I just ask people who are not speaking, could you do us a favour, please, and just turn off your videos and your microphones? The reason why, it'll give us more bandwidth for those who've got weak connections. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Monica. Well, welcome to this exciting and important professional development event for Social Science Week at Charles Sturt University. My name, as Bishop Mark said, is Stephen Pickard. I'm Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture at Charles Sturt University, and we're delighted to be joining as partners and a co-host of this important event. The topic, of course, is absolutely relevant and critical in our particular contemporary context: Christianity, disability, and indigeneity. What do these mean for person-directed practice, policy and politics in pluralist Australia? As you know, the original plan was to hold this event at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture in Canberra. However, all CSU events for Social Science Week are now online due to COVID-19, and so I welcome you to Zoom land, probably for all of you, not for the first time. In a moment, we will begin the morning of two formal lectures, which will go for 30 minutes approximately. But and following the lectures, there'll be an informal panel which will be chaired by Bishop Mark Short. Could I please, and delighted to introduce Brad Braithwaite, the Deputy CEO of Anglican New South Wales, South and West and the ACT. Over to you, Brad.
Thank you very much, Bishop Stephen. I work for Anglicare, New South Wales, South, West and ACT. However, I just wanted to say a few words on behalf of one of the key partners for today, Embracing Ministries, who is a partner of Anglicare, but also really engaged in the organisation of this event. The director of Embracing Ministries, Andrea, couldn't be with us today, unfortunately. She's got personal matters to attend to. So I'm honoured to just say a few things about Embracing Ministries on her behalf. They're a Canberra-based organisation, and they support the spiritual growth and discipleship of people who live with disability and their families. And Anglicare works very proudly with Embracing Ministries in the community in the work they do. And their work is really at the sharp end of need for a lot of families who don't have access to the services that lots of other people take advantage of. So their goal and their objective at Embracing Ministries is to show people who are affected by disability and having palliative care that God loves them, and they do this through pastoral care at schools, at home, in hospital and in the community, through a lot of advocacy work that they do with government, particularly for refugees and those who may not have access to government support, and practical interventions as well with refugee families, and through parent retreats and sibling support groups. They really focus not just on those living with disability, but the support around them in their families, and they do a wonderful job. And also they support those families through prayer. They also Andrea and her team are passionate about integrating people who live with disability into everyday life, and they do a wonderful job with that. They do a lot of training and equipping and mobilising of community volunteers, a lot of holiday programs and music programs, services and special events. So they do so much in the community that's just we're so grateful for. And another really important thing that Embracing Ministries does is it reminds the church, Christian schools, Christian organisations and individual believers that God has a special place in his heart for the vulnerable. And it's indeed why Anglicare exists as well. And this is such an important thing for us all to remember, in humility and the grace of God, that we can actually do, have the privilege of doing things like that. So I'd just like to acknowledge Embracing Ministries and Andrea and her part in helping Monica and Dominic to organise this event today, and really excited on behalf of Anglicare to be here, and look forward to our CEO, Jeremy, will speak a little bit later. But yeah, thanks everybody, and thank you to Andrea and her team at Embracing Ministries. Thank you, Brad, for everybody's information. Besides the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture and Embracing Ministries, of course, this event is being partnered and co-hosted with Anglicare, the Anglican Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn, radio station for people living with print disabilities, IRPH, and Common Grace. So we're very grateful for all of those partners as part of this. And let's now move on to our first public lecture. It's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce the Associate Professor Dominic O'Sullivan, Associate Professor in Political Science at Charles Sturt University. Dominic is a political scientist and a Maori scholar. He has worked at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand, before coming to Charles Sturt in 2008. He's over 50 refereed research publications, including more than 30 refereed journal articles and books, and book chapters, and 6 books. He's had extensive political commentary experience for ABC Radio, and has written for The Conversation, The Open Forum, the New Zealand Herald, and a number of other places. Dominic's work has had significant public policy influence in both New Zealand and Australia and beyond, and he's a member of the Charles Sturt University's Academic Senate. We are delighted, Dominic, that you are going to kickstart this important event
we'd like to invite you now to speak to us. And the title is, I Have Come in Order That You May Have Life, Life and All Its Fullness, Faith, Indigeneity and Human Rights. So welcome, Dominic.
Kia ora, e pehopa. Ko te mea tatai a mi ana ki te rongarawa, I o matua kore. He honore he karorea ki tana ingoa, he maunga rongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Hangai e tātua he ngā kauhau ki roto ki tēnā o mātou. Whakatongia tau wairua tapu, he awhina he tohu a mātou, he arataki hoki a mātou I tēnei rā. Ake, amen. Ko mamari te waka, ko te rarawa te iwi, ko te uri o hina te hapu, ko te uri o hina te marae. Ko Dominic O'Sullivan ahau. Thank you, Bishop. I began with what we call in Maori mihi mihi and pepeha, and very much in an abbreviated form. Mihi mihi is a greeting, and my greeting was to Io matua kore, Io the beginning, Io the end. It's a traditional Maori word for God, for the supreme being in his name we gather here today. And then I introduced myself as being from the Te Rarawa iwi, or tribe in the far north of New Zealand. For those who know the North Island, Te Rarawa is the area around Kaitaia, sort of the northernmost town of any significance in New Zealand. So that's how I've begun, but now I move into the paper itself, which begins with that remark from John's Gospel, I have come in order that you might have life and all its fullness. An idea that draws connections among faith, indigeneity and human rights. As Brown explained, the theological message is uncompromising and binds all who profess Jesus as Lord. That does not allow for discrimination, for greed or for injustice. Justice in this context is the recognition of a body of rights discernible from the common good. Justice is inextricably linked with the human condition. Human suffering, stemming from racism, for example, is thus more than a political or ethical question. It is, as Garrett argues, also a matter of Christology, that is, of how we understand the incarnate God. Because, as Garrett continues, God in Christ is present in suffering people. And as Jesus himself remarked, inasmuch as you did it unto one of these, the least of thy brethren, you did it unto me. Human rights are a reflection of the inviolable dignity of the human person. They preclude racism, preserve human unity, and protect each person's ability to share in the common good of the whole community. For Thomas Aquinas, the common good means all the preconditions for the achievement of each person's individual good. Aquinas said that because God is the sovereign good, it belongs to him to make all things best. And it is better that the good bestowed on someone should be common to many, since the common good is always considered more godlike than the good of one only. Pope John XXIII argued that there is a consequent obligation on every person to claim their human rights as marks of their dignity, and also to recognise those rights in others. This is because, de Torre explains, if God is the common good of society, the common good of society must therefore be a social order which empowers or facilitates every individual in it to attain his or her own perfection. In other words, what is material or purely earthly must be for the sake of what is spiritual, not for its own sake. While the Church claims a religious but not a political mission, it cannot attend to that mission without proclaiming its beliefs in the secular political realm, and in relation to secular political choices. Alternatively, as Pope John Paul II explained, the Christian experience can sometimes be reduced to a too inward-looking attitude of personal well-being and to the assimilation of a set of vague principles, which are insufficiently clear or strong in the face of the present challenge to faith. By virtue of human creation in the image and likeness of God, personhood encompasses an essential dignity, inherent and inviolable. If, as John XXIII argued, we look upon the dignity of the human person in the light of divinely revealed truth, we cannot help but esteem it far more highly. For men are redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ. They are, by grace, the children and friends of God and heirs of glory. Racism thus infringes human rights. In the Exodus narrative, for example, God delivers the Israelites from Egyptian oppression and establishes that one may not ill-treat or oppress a foreigner. Remember that you were foreigners in Egypt. Leviticus extends this point. Do not ill-treat foreigners who are living in your land. Treat them as you would a fellow Israelite, and love them as you love yourselves. Remember that you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. In Deuteronomy, God's curse on anyone who deprives foreigners, orphans, and widows of their rights. Racial prejudice, discrimination, and ideals of cultural superiority have caused significant suffering among colonised populations in Australia and elsewhere. In 1971, the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference pastoral letter, simply entitled Racism, argued that the New Testament establishes that racism is foreign to the mind of Christ, because it is a barrier to a proper relationship with God. During the 19th century and much of the 20th, a narrowness of interpretation meant that the question of how the Australian Church should respond to political questions that compromised human dignity was not always considered, and indeed these compromises often were not even identified. There was a common but erroneous view among church leaders that politics was beyond their legitimate interest, an assumption which could justify inaction and promote indifference. Many maintained a rigid distinction between politics and religion, and did not widely consider the possibility that each had implications for the other. Yet at the same time, prelates like Archbishop Polding, who argued vociferously for the rights of Indigenous peoples, did so out of a sense of religious duty, not from a commitment to any political cause. More recently in Australia, the relationship between religious ideas and their expression in the secular realm emerges very strongly in the politics of reconciliation, or public sorrow and its implications. In 1997, the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission's inquiry into the removal of Indigenous children from their families recommended reconciliation as a structured and ongoing response. It understood the concept as comprising acknowledgement and apology, guarantees against repetition, measures of restitution, measures of rehabilitation, and monetary compensation. For the Church, these secular objectives give effect to religious ideals, paralleled in sacramental understandings of reconciliation as the correction of a fractured relationship with God at a personal level. It requires sorrow, forgiveness, and resolve not to repeat the transgression. Forgiveness requires that resolve, and its secular equivalent is a process for correcting social or political transgressions of justice. Apologies meet the symbolic requirements of sorrow, while reparation involves the perpetrator correcting, as far as possible, the ongoing impact of the initial transgression. As Dance put it, saying sorry commits us to working in a creative partnership with the Indigenous people of Australia in overcoming the tragic aftermath of this pain and loss. Sorrow, then, makes reparation and restitution inescapable preconditions for future political relationships of trust. Reconciliation conceptualises unjust secular political decisions as the product of social sin. From this view stems a Christian duty to contribute to the construction of a just social order as an expression of human solidarity. Reconciliation is concerned with the ways in which Christianity creates a public and contextual theology that in Australia responds to transgressions of the dignity of the human person. Some have argued that saying sorry necessarily imposes personal guilt on citizens who have no personal history of abuse against Indigenous peoples. The former Prime Minister, John Howard, was a leading proponent of this view. I don't believe that current generations of Australians should be seen as responsible for deeds over which they had no control and in which they had no involvement. Howard's view misinterprets the theological basis to sorrow. As Prowse explains, concepts of collective guilt are to be dismissed as theologically without foundation, and indeed adding unnecessary confusion to the issue. What is important about sorrow, Prowse continues, is that it imposes a grave moral responsibility to dispel the ideologies, ignorance and biases in which racist attitudes may still fester and largely be hidden from conscious awareness. There was consequently no moral integrity in the position that because the removal of children had been legal at the time it occurred, there was no obligation on Howard's government to make recompense to those affected. Indeed, while public attention focused on Howard's refusal to say sorry, his refusal to admit the propriety of compensation was at least as inhibiting of reconciliation. Government reluctance to admit a necessary relationship between sorrow and recompense remains an obstacle to reconciliation in Australia. Yet there are examples from New Zealand which demonstrate the symbolic importance of saying sorry and show that reparation, which includes sharing the benefits of an economy built on dispossession, is required as a consequence. In New Zealand, the arguments are not about whether or not to provide redress, rather they concern the form and extent of that compensation. When in 2008 the new Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, moved a motion of apology as his government's first item of parliamentary business, widespread public enthusiasm demonstrated that reconciliation was never entirely removed from public consciousness. Rudd's speech, moving the motion, showed the simplicity of apology. It acknowledged the significance of the past to the present and future in a way that Howard did not admit. Reconciliation's substantive concern does, however, remain with the future, and Rudd's speech was ambitiously hopeful and, in fact, premature in respectfully requesting that this apology be received in the spirit in which it is offered as part of the healing of the nation. For the future we take heart, resolving that this new page in the history of our great continent can now be written. Saying sorry is certainly concerned with a new page in national history, but reconciliation still requires further steps of truly tangible substance. Sorrow does not on its own remove what Rudd called a great stain from the nation's soul. That is very much an ongoing process and will occur only with transgenerational bipartisan support and substantive policy developments of the sort the Prime Minister envisaged, but as yet has been unable to be put to the test of time. The concrete steps towards reconciliation, which Pope Benedict XVI acknowledged to the Prime Minister during his World Youth Day visit to Sydney in 2008, reflected an important change in policy direction. In that sense, the apology was courageous, as the Pope suggested. However, some time must inevitably pass before one can fully accept Benedict's remark that this example of reconciliation offers hope to peoples all over the world who long to see their rights affirmed and their contribution to society acknowledged and promoted. What the Pope's observation so soon after the parliamentary apology did show, however, was the inescapable nexus between theological precepts and political decisions. a connection between faith and human rights that is necessarily connected to Indigenous claims on the state and to self-determination as an established human right. Reconciliation is the subject of philosophical contest. It is not an absolute and objectively fair condition, as state and Indigenous aspirations compete from different conceptions of justice that have to be constantly rebalanced through the political process. However, from an Indigenous perspective, it is generally held that justice is possible only through the genuine reconciliation of Indigenous claims with those of the state, with justice in turn preliminary to the state's presumption of moral legitimacy. In this context, it is significant that the Uniting Church, among others, endorsed in 2012 proposals to amend the Commonwealth Constitution to recognise Indigenous prior occupancy and remove powers of racial discrimination as courageous steps towards reconciliation. Reconciliation means recognising human rights as a body of political capacities, discernible from the common good. Such recognition is evident in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for example. The declaration was adopted in 2007, originally opposed by Australia, though in 2009 accepted as what the government of the day called an aspirational document. The declaration affirms the rights to culture and religious freedom. That, as a matter of principle, the Indigenous family is prior to the state. It affirms the right to independence on the one hand, and the right to meaningful participation in the state on the other. The right to language is a mark of cultural distinction, and therefore a mark of human dignity. These are religious precepts with profound implications for secular politics. The idea that human rights are universal, that they belong to Indigenous peoples as much as they belong to anyone, is inconsistent with colonialism's essential presumption that race determines a hierarchy of entitlement, a hierarchy of human worth, where the interests of some are morally superior to the rights of others. A view that the Christian Church has often supported, sometimes by its actions and sometimes by its silence. Reconciliation to correct the consequences of its own transgressions of justice is a matter of affirming connections among faith, indigeneity and human rights. To this end, the Anglican Observer to the United Nations has contributed to international advocacy in favour of the Declaration. The Holy See has noted the connection between faith and human rights in this context. In conclusion, reconciliation looks beyond the immediate. It is not a policy prescription that can be achieved and put to one side within the typically short timeframes of contemporary liberal democratic politics. But the questions remain, as Brennan has asked: what are the signs of reconciliation? How do we know that it has arrived? In other words, how do we know when theological precepts of sin, conversion and forgiveness have had sustained influence over political programs to the point that Indigenous peoples' quality of life and capacity to make decisions about the things that are important to them has been secured? Brennan's own answer is that reconciliation, like justice, is never perfectly achieved. Its celebration is not conditional upon perfect outcomes, but it is transformative, and its celebration conditional upon the political goals of stability and cohesion, the granting of recompense, the sharing of economic opportunities, and uncontested recognition of substantive Indigenous political participation, land rights, and authority over their own affairs. Conditional on these expressions of the right to be Indigenous, because, as the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference has argued, a peaceful and harmonious society is the fruit of justice, not of false understandings of what constitutes equality. Thank you.
So before anything happens, I'd like to, as Dominic's colleague, do a Maori tradition, which is to sing Dominic off the stage. I can't sing, so please be patient with this, but I want to honour my Maori colleague with a Maori tradition.
Kia
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. Thank you, Dominic.
Thanks, Monica. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dominic. That was wonderful. And we look forward to the text of that, and it's being uploaded. I know many of us would like to re-engage with some of those insights that you've brought to us. So thank you.
Thank you.
The second lecture this morning is from Monica Short. Monica, who you know well, a social work lecturer and researcher at Charles Sturt University in the School of Humanities and the Social Sciences. And she's the author of the book Anglican Churches Engaging with People Living with Disabilities. And a special congratulations to Monica, soon to be awarded her doctorate from CSU, and it'll be Dr. Monica Short on the way. So delighted, Monica. And
I think Stephen's been frozen.
This wonderful event, and your effervescent, or the topic that you're about to lead us in, person-directedness, empowering people who are Christians and are receiving services. So thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a real honour to be sharing a platform with people that I strongly admire. And thank you, Dominic, for your lecture. That was very fascinating. And I'm really looking forward to the two panels where people will start sharing about their lived experience as well down the track. But it's very exciting to be here. So the aim of my lecture is I'm going to be helping think through and defining person-directedness within practice, policy and political settings. I'll be introducing us to the richness and diversity of pluralist Australia, focusing on Christianity and disability. I'll be also promoting Are You OK Day. Today is Are You OK Day, and the need to uphold people's psychosocial and spiritual well-being. I'll also be illustrating person-directedness through an anonymised case study of Eve. And what I'm saying is actually grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, which states everyone has a right to religion, and also the Sustainable Development Goal 10 target, which includes empower and promote the social, economic and political inclusion of all, irrespective of disability, race, ethnicity, origin and religion. I'll be focusing on disability as Dominic has just focused on indigeneity. Before I get into it too much, I just want to share with you the completed research projects that I'll be drawing on for today's talk. And there's just 8 projects there. I'll leave this slide up for a little second if people want to take a quick photo, if they want to read any of the research projects later. But that's where I'm drawing the knowledge from. And in saying that, I'd like to thank the partners who helped with those research projects: Charles Sturt University, CBM Australia, Luke 14 program, and I think Joseph Pincard was going to join us today, Bush Church Aid, the Anglican Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn, the Anglican Diocese of Bendigo, and the Aboriginal Evangelical Fellowship. And what exactly am I going to do? Well, I'm going to go through there's 3 stages to this lecture. The first is we're going to play with theory, and I'm going to give you a number of theoretical concepts. Don't be overwhelmed by them. Most of the time I get told the most exciting bit is usually the last stage when I tell the stories. So hang in for the stories if the theory is a bit too rich for you. Then we're going to chew through quickly some stats and facts about Christianity and disability. And like I said, I'm going to share a story from the research as well. So let's start playing with theory. What I want to do is just explain to you some background thinking before I actually start talking about person-directedness. Now, we did a research project, a group of us, and that research project is listed, the reference is listed on the screen. So if people want to look at it later, they're welcome to. For those who are listening and unable to see the screen, the research reference is Short M, Dempsey K, Ackland J, Rush E, Heller E, Dwyer H, 2018. What is a person? Deepening students' and colleagues' understanding of person-centeredness, and it's published in the Advances in Social Work and Welfare Education. So when we did this research project, we had a lot of fun doing it. What we did was we categorized an understanding of personhood into 3 categories. There seems to be a trend within kind of academic thinking that personhood and being human can either be seen together as connected or seen as separate. And there's 3 kind of approaches to that. The approach that I prefer and use within my work is the connected spiritual approach, where we focus upon Judeo-Christian concepts. So in that kind of approach, what happens is personhood and being human are strongly connected. There's no difference being seen at all. Similar to that approach is the connected secular. In contrast to that approach is the disconnected view, which is the view that personhood and humanity can be separated. You can be a person, but you're not necessarily human. And I strongly disagree with that idea. And like I said, just for your own information, my positionality, i.e. where I stand, is in the connected spiritual, where I see everybody as made in the image of God. And I see everybody as deserving of love from God and love from their neighbour, because everybody is precious. So that idea of connected spirituality in terms of humanity, in terms of personhood, influences how I then see person-directedness and personalisation. The person-directed approach is one of the personalisation approaches to practice, policy and politics. Personalisation approaches can be defined as a person in environment perspective that values people's independence and rights, emphasises tailored services, co-production, choice, and control in service delivery, and facilitates the inclusion of all in groups, communities, and society. And the framework that I use when I'm using person-directed approach is this, what you see on the screen. And it's just one example. There's many, many frameworks that can be used when using a person-directed approach, but this is my personal one, and I'm sharing it with you so you can see how a Christian framework fits very comfortably within person-directed practice, politics, and policy. And I've broken it into three categories. We've got being, thinking, and doing. Now, if you have a look, you'll see 3 circles. The outside circle is the being. And being is the ontology, the essence of who we are. It's impossible to separate from practice, policy, and politics when we're doing that, who we are, the essence. We bring ourselves the moment that we start entering into practice, policy, and politics. And the being is personal. So for me, it's about my Christian faith, my understanding of the Bible. The professional is also important in my being. And for me, it's the Australian Association's Social Workers Code of Ethics. And there are other things that impact on my being. For example, the United Nations Human Rights documents. So my being informs my thinking. And my thinking, you can see, is the second circle inside, the middle circle inside the 3 circles. And that's the theoretical approach, the epistemologies. Epistemology just means knowledge base. And so my thinking is informed by my being, and my thinking informs my practice, policy, and political stance. And for me personally, I take a participatory theory approach. So in other words, the subjective and the objective of what's happening in life are in relationship together, and I see how they relate together. Or another example is the person receiving a service, the person living with disabilities, for example, who may be seeing a service, and not everybody living with disabilities receives services, but for some people who do, and the people providing services are in relationship together. They share power together. It's about moving between each other so that people have choice. I also use in my thinking what's called an integrated lens with an epistemological base in social work, sociology, and theology. Now that might sound a little bit fancy, but basically what it means is the three disciplines come together and there's a focal point where they all meet. And I practice in that focal point. In my work, I'm also very interested in narrative. I want to hear people's stories and honour those stories because they're beautiful. And I want to see people empowered. So empowerment is important to me. I want to see people flourish and just enjoy the life and blessings that God has given them. So my being and my thinking then goes on, informs my doing. My doing is the methodology, how I actually do the action of practice, policy, and politics. And all those three levels, the being, thinking, and doing, are influenced by person-directedness. So for example, if I'm a case manager and doing case management, then my being, thinking, and doing will inform how I go about working with someone through case management. Now, a good question to ask, I think, would be to think, does that framework and bringing the Christian essence of who I am and critically thinking and evaluating what is it that I'm bringing when I'm working with people, either through practice, policy, or politics, is to wonder about the person-directed principles and make sure they all fit. And I've listed a whole heap of random principles up there, and they all fit. There's no clash or tension. And let me give you an example. So one of the principles of person-directedness is social inclusion. And if you have a look on the picture on the slide, you'll actually see a picture of three birds. One of the birds is looking on. It's not included in what's going on at all. It's excluded. And that bird is not part of any kind of intimate discussion, relationship, friendship. It's totally excluded. And it's watching the other two birds. The other two birds are included. They're connected together. They're sharing a secret together. And you can see them, they're very close to each other, and there's quite a warmth going on between them. The framework that I'm suggesting is wanting to see the bird that's by itself, or in the case of working with people, the person that's excluded, move from exclusion to authentic belonging in community, because that person is made in the image of God and is precious. So that's a little bit of the theory, and we played around a little bit, but now I'm going to chew with you through some of the stats, because person-directedness also talks about knowing the people that we're working with. And Australia is a pluralistic society. We have lots of different people, and that's the exciting thing about Australia. Like, I love how we're all different. So the following stats are based on these ABS and other websites, but I'm just going to take you through really quickly about the diversity of Australia in terms of religion. So if you have a look at this slide, you'll see that Christianity is a significant population group within Australia. And so when we're working with people, it's quite likely that a significant number of the people that we're living with, that we're working with, will actually be Christians. Other religions and non-religion are also significant populations that we're working with. And we need to understand what that means so that when we're working with people, we're working in a person-directed way that's holistic and culturally and spiritually sensitive so that all people's needs are being met. And that's regardless of what state we're in, because if you have a look at that table on the slide, you can see that Christianity, other religions and no religions are all significant populations, no matter where we're working in Australia. Now, in terms of disability, in 2018, 4.4 million Australians lived with disabilities, 17.7% of the population. Of the 4.4 million Australians living with disabilities in 2018, over 3/4 reported a physical disorder as their main condition. And the most common physical disorder was musculoskeletal disorders. That's things like back problems and arthritis. In terms of Christianity, a 2016 National Church Life survey of 1,278 church attendees in Australia found that 3% had profound severe disabilities, 12% were living with mild disabilities, and 23% had a close family member living with disabilities. And so we can assume that there will be a significant number of people who are receiving services who want to express themselves and their faith. The statistics indicate that. So if we're working with people and we're taking a person-directed approach, and we're taking a particularly connected approach that a person is a human together and to be respected and treated with deep dignity, then we want to understand what's important to them. And if faith is important to them, or even the wanting to learn about faith is important to them, then that becomes important to our work. Now today is Are You OK Day, where we ask, how are you? We take the time to actually think about other people. And to be honest, that shouldn't be just happening today, it should be happening to every day. But a pilot report by the Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2017 into coroner-referred deaths, which captured information on certain psychosocial factors alongside other associated causes, highlighted that key factors such as past history of self-harm, relationship issues, legal and financial concerns, and disability were commonly associated with suicide deaths. This is a big deal, and we need to actually wonder about why is this happening. But more importantly for that, when we're doing practice, policy, and politics, we need to look out for people, and we need to ask people, are you okay? So if we're working, for example, in a service that's working alongside the NDIS, we need to wonder and check constantly, are you okay? And then wonder, what can we do? Notice the word we. What can we do? And then check in and have follow-up conversations and see how people are traveling. And why do that from a Christian perspective? Well, because every person is our brother and sister, and we're our brother and sister's keepers, because they're made in the image of God. So right now, I've taken us through theory. We've played with the theory. We've chewed through the statistics very quickly. I'm now going to take us into starting to think about examples and what does spiritually competent practice mean? Well, when thinking about it, person-directedness is really about the power of the person. And I love this picture. This is my friend Giselle. And Giselle makes me happy all the time. Every time I feel down, I know I just got to give her a call, and by the end of it, I'm feeling very good. And I love this picture of Giselle because she's looking so happy when she's out bushwalking. And we need to honour the power of the person. Giselle is my colleague. She's a social worker. She's a retired social worker. But she is also my friend, and she is vibrant and beautiful and fearfully and wonderfully made by God. So that's the first thing we remember, the power of the person in person-directedness. And no matter what discipline we're coming to, when we're thinking about the power of the person and how precious and wonderful they are, we're taking it within a holistic approach. So we're not looking at excluding a discipline when we're working with that idea. So regardless whether we're thinking philosophically in our practice, policy and politics, and we're wondering about the uniqueness of the person, or if we're thinking about social work or humanistic or sociology, you know, the other things that are up there, we don't exclude any discipline. We also think theologically that people can be known by God, chaplaincy, that people are worthwhile and spiritual beings, that we actually aim to have a holistic and deep and rich understanding of personhood and what it means to be person-directed in our practice, policy and politics. And why? Well, I'd like to share an example, a story. And the reason why is because it gives the person the power of choice, faith, and the sense of belonging. I'd like to introduce you to Eve. Now, Eve's someone I met through the research, and she's an inspiration. I loved talking with Eve. Her details have been anonymised because of the research project, and so I've changed her name and a few of the details have changed. But the essence of the story is there, and it's a true story. So Eve is living with intellectual disabilities. Eve, when I met her, talked to me about growing up. And growing up wasn't easy for Eve. When she was at school, it was assumed that she couldn't learn. And most of her life, people have assumed she can't learn and that she needs things done for her. She doesn't like that sense of feeling excluded. And she also feels like she's often have been forced through her life to watch what's going on in society and not actually actively participate. She's known loneliness. What happened for Eve was a neighbour invited her to church. And Eve realised that she had a choice. She could choose to go to church, which she did. And she loves her neighbour. They get along really, really well and they have a great time together. She enjoyed going to church. Eve also wanted to know about God and Jesus and think about things. And she realised that she has a choice and that she can do that. And she's enjoying that. Like if she wants to join the craft group or Bible or whatever, she has choice and she can do that. But not only that, she's respected. Who she is, the essence of who she is, her faith is respected and she's given dignity. And she talks about how people at church talk to her and are not paid to talk to her and how powerful that is for her. She also talks about the sense of belonging. She talks about when she has morning tea, people tease her and she belongs and they miss her. And if she's having a third piece of cake, they say, "You really want a third piece of cake?" And they giggle and muck around together. And this community, her church community, is where she belongs. The power of choice, faith, and belonging. And when we've got that, we start to see beyond the person, the person's impairment, beyond the chair in the pictures. We start to see the beauty and the preciousness of the person who's made in the image of God. And Eve's story continues. Eve told me how excited she was when the minister asked her, would she like to join the morning tea roster? And she said to me, for the first time in her life, she felt like she could do something for somebody else and she was going to make her little community better. And she loves being on the morning tea roster. And she has a new identity because of that. She has the identity of ability. I can do something for somebody else. And her whole face glows when she talks about being on the morning tea roster. But not only that, when the roster comes out every couple of months, she has proof that she can give to other people, and that she's making the world better, and that she has an important role to play and has identity. She feels respected. She likes having dignity. So when we're thinking about practice, policy, or politics, do we also think about how we're reducing inequality? How we can give all people, including people living with disabilities, choice, the choice to have their spiritual needs met. And so to conclude, I consider personhood and humanity as strongly connected. There is no difference. And based on the spiritually connected, person-directed view and my own critical self-reflection about my practice, my thinking about policy and politics, I'm proposing that person-directed means knowing the person we're working with well. It is recognising that Australia is a pluralist society and that Christians, alongside people from other faiths and people with no religion, are a significant population who we service as practitioners, policymakers and politicians. And I wish to propose that practitioners, policymakers and politicians use a spiritually sensitive, culturally aware framework in their work with others. And that they understand from the perspective of the individual, i.e. from the perspective of Eve, and that individual's lived experience, what does Christianity, disability, and in Dominic's lecture, indigeneity means. And I encourage us to remember that people like Eve, who are living with disabilities, matter immensely and are made in the image of God. And that my hope is that every person will know what Eve knows and has. And that is to have their spiritual needs met, to know authentic belonging, and to have the choice to flourish in a Christian community. I propose that when we're working with people who are receiving services, that we remember, yes, they need services. They need food. They need housing. They need warmth. And when we're making our referrals or whatever else we're doing, we're scoping policy or we're thinking about political actions, that we remember that, yes, they need services, but they also need to know more than a bureaucracy. People need spiritual care, dignity, and love. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for that stimulating and transformative reflection on how we can engage with people, respecting every aspect of their humanity, their spiritual beliefs. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more reflections on that theme from our panels in just a little while. I'm going to introduce two of our partners who are helping us present this virtual seminar. Firstly, we're going to hear from Brooke Prentice from Common Grace, and then Jeremy Halcrow from Anglican.
Hi everyone, it's Brooke Prentice here, the CEO of Common Grace. It's really exciting for me to be CEO as an Aboriginal woman, a descendant of the Waka Waka peoples, and I came into the role of CEO in February, and it's the first time a Christian organisation in these lands now called Australia a national Christian organisation that isn't specifically Indigenous has had an Aboriginal person as its national leader or CEO. So it's a very exciting time, a historic appointment, but also tinged with sadness that it took until 2020 for this to occur, but an example to other Christian organisations and the Australian Church and wider Australian society. So as a partner, Common Grace is super excited to be a partner, and Common Grace is a movement of peoples pursuing Jesus and justice. Over 50,000 peoples engaged with Common Grace. We are a diverse grassroots movement, particularly of Christians who reach across denominational, theological and political lines to find common ground. Collectively, we envision and work towards a world where we are led by Aboriginal Christian leaders to see friendship and reconciliation in our lifetime. Also, where those who come to our shores for safety and asylum are welcomed with compassion. Where there is an end to the epidemic of violence against women, and churches and faith communities are safe places for victims of domestic and family violence. And where, even in the midst of a climate crisis, God's beautiful creation is protected and restored. We listen and share the stories of injustice and create space for truth-telling about our history, the true history of these lands now called Australia. We equip people and communities to understand and identify injustice and to follow Jesus' call to love our neighbours. And we mobilise Christians to undertake meaningful and coordinated action to bring about change. Whilst doing all of this, we add a gracious and Christian voice to the public sphere. Some of our major initiatives and things where we call people into the movement are the Change the Heart prayer services being led by one of our most senior Aboriginal Christian leaders in Australia, Auntie Jean Phillips, calling people together in the lead up to January 26. Aboriginal Sunday, we advocate for an end to Aboriginal deaths in custody. Season of Creation, Earth Overshoot Day, Refugee Week, and then individual actions for people to take. So many ways to get involved with the work of Common Grace. So we are, as Common Grace, united for the common good, finding common ground, sharing in common grace, while we pursue Jesus and justice. So great to be a partner as Common Grace for this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. And Brooke will be one of our panellists in just a little while. We're now going to hear from Jeremy Halgrove from another of our partners.
Jeremy, we can't hear you. Do you want to check your microphone? The mic is on, but there's no noise, sorry. Ben, are you still there with us?
Jeremy, if you want to, next to the start your audio or mute button, there should be a little arrow that'll come when you hover your mouse over it. If you click that, you may have to select your microphone. Nope, still not working. No?
We don't seem to be picking up Jeremy's sound. Is Brad from Anglican still with us?
Oh, yeah. Hi, Bishop Mark. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I'm not sure what's going on there. I had a meeting with Jeremy earlier and it was fine, so must be something with the settings, Jeremy. I guess, if Jeremy can't get the microphone to work, on behalf of Anglican, I'd just like to say we're really excited to be part of this event, and this is really something that's dear to Jeremy's and my heart in terms of how an organisation like Anglicare, which works across both disability and has disability services ourselves, but also works with Indigenous communities around regional New South Wales, we feel that the topic of today's conversation is really vitally important for us and something that we need to engage with a lot of thought as an organisation, because I think, as Monica had said in her great presentation, we live in a wonderfully pluralistic society, and as a service provider with many different stakeholders, it's often difficult to navigate how we deal with our mission. And our mission as Anglican is very clear. It's very clearly to help alleviate not just material poverty, but spiritual poverty. It's part of our purpose as an organisation. And so I think, as Monica said in her presentation, if you take a person-centred approach to how you deliver services, you have to acknowledge that we're spiritual beings, and the data clearly shows that. And I think to honour the dignity of individuals, we need to absolutely honour that. That fact that many people need a way to engage with their spiritual side. In our services and the way we deliver our services, it's vitally important for all of our staff, and we're just very thankful for the opportunity to have this as a resource for our staff. And Sarah Plummer, who looks after our mission and culture, will be adding this to our suite of workforce development tools, and it's a really can be a really integral part of what we provide to our staff in terms of grappling with how we help with spiritual poverty and spiritual needs. Yeah, I'm not sure if Jeremy's had a chance to get back on, but perhaps maybe later, Bishop Mark.
We'll get there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you to Common Grace. Thank you to Anglicare, and thank you to all of our partners. Your presence and your partnership today is very much valued. An important part of today is sharing the lived experience, hearing from people who are engaging on a day-by-day basis with the issues that Dominic and Monica have spoken about. We have 2 3-person panels to help us do just that. I'm going to be introducing our first panel in a little while. I'll have some questions for them, but if you other attendees have questions that you'd like directed to panel members, you can do so using the chat function, and we'll keep an eye on that and bring them to the panel. When we come to the panel, what we're going to ask you to do is, if you are not on the panel, to mute yourself and hide your video so that we see the faces of all our panel members on the screen. So panel members would like to share their video, please. Hello, Brooke.
Hello.
Hello, Kathy and Dominic. Let me introduce our 3 panel members. Firstly, Auntie Kathy Naden, who we heard from with our acknowledgement of country, an Arable woman from South Australia, a Christian leader within the Aboriginal Evangelical Fellowship, and a community engagement officer. Welcome again, Kathy.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Dominic O'Sullivan, once again, Associate Professor at Charles Sturt University, and thirdly, Brooke Prentice, the CEO of Common Grace. So if those 3 folk could share their videos, and if you're not hide your video, that would be wonderful. I can see you all. Just wondering if our panel members, are there any aspects of presentations that you'd like to comment on?
Certainly. I might just start off. Certainly with Dominic's presentation was really important, and I think highlighting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Populations is really important. And some of the questions out there for people is how to reconcile, how to approach Aboriginal people, how to change or improve our services, and how to care for Aboriginal people. I think the declaration actually, when you look at the articles, it certainly gives you direction and guidance. So if you're not familiar with any of the United Nations Declaration, then I think it's really important that you as an individual, as an organisation, really take that on board and do some study around what that looks like, what that means, and even involving local Aboriginal people from your communities to be involved in some of that education as well. It's a conversation that needs to be had by everybody within Australia, regardless of what walk of life you come from, and really important.
Thanks, Kathy. Dominic, anything you'd like to comment on in particular?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I've already had a good go, but I think the connection for me between my paper and Monica's in terms of the overall theme is that human right to be who you are and to engage with the world as who you are. Whether that's the case of Eve that Monica talked about, or whether it's an Indigenous person going to school and being Indigenous while they're at school, and so on. So I think that's the connection for me that's really important.
Thank you. And Brooke, any aspects of the presentations that you'd particularly like to comment on?
I'd just like to thank both Dominic and Monica for their presentations, and also thank Auntie Kathy Naden for her acknowledgement of country earlier as well. I think they were great presentations to go side by side each other, and I'm still thinking through lots of both of those presentations. I think one of the things that's at front of mind for me is I've just been participating in a community services industry alliance in a cultural exchange with New Zealand. And Ken Karahoma, who's a Maori man, said one of the slogans in New Zealand is "What is good for Maori is good for New Zealand." And I think we've still got a long way to go in embracing that in Australia, but how much healing could come from embracing that, not just for Aboriginal peoples, but for all peoples in these lands now called Australia. And that, reconciliation is an interesting word for us as Aboriginal peoples. And personally, sometimes I like the word, other times I hate the word. It's just become a word. But you can't have reconciliation without truth and action. And I guess when I reflect on Monica's presentation, yes, we have to, and when we think about these lands now called Australia and how Aboriginal peoples are viewed and our human dignity was denied on the 29th of April, 1770, when Cook, on first seeing Aboriginal peoples, took out his gun and shot at us, wounding Kuman of the Guigal peoples. And we've still been fighting for that human dignity today in 2020. But we have to start by knowing Aboriginal peoples, but do you actually really know Aboriginal peoples and understand community, understand these lands now called Australia? Not just a past of 250 years, but over 65,000 years, thousands of years of custodianship, stewardship, governance, caring for community. Auntie Kathy, in her acknowledgement, talked about country. Country is all lands, all waters, all trees, all plants, all sky, all birds, all fish, and all peoples. And so our elders teach us, care for country and country will care for you. And so the person is always within community. And so let us come back to what community is, and to make sure that Aboriginal peoples are part of community of Australia, but we always have been and always will be, because we've been here for thousands of years. And so how do we look upon this with fresh eyes, and fresh hearts, fresh ears, that deep listening, where as Aboriginal people we listen with our whole beings. It's with our ears, our eyes, our minds and our hearts, our whole being, and what we can teach non-Indigenous Australia, which I think both Dominic and Monica are calling for.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Dominic. Just a reminder, if folk who are attending would like to raise a question with the panel, particularly about Christianity and indigeneity, you can do so using the chat function. A common thread in both the presentations was the importance of recognising, acknowledging and celebrating the diverse aspects of what makes up each human being as a person. I'm just wondering if panel members would like to reflect on how different aspects of their personal identity interact with each other, particularly how does your Christian faith intersect with your identity as an Indigenous person?
I guess for me, it's the core of my being. They're one. I can't separate the fact that I'm an Aboriginal person with the fact that I am also Christian. God has played a huge role in shaping me, who I am today, and He has become my everything. How do I separate those two? I don't. As an Aboriginal person, categorising things and labelling things and separating something which is a part of your being is not possible for me. I can only talk on lived experience and my own journey with God, but that's how I see it. It's not something that you can separate. We are one.
Thank you, Kathy. Dominic or Brooke, anything you'd like to share in response to the question?
Well, I think all sorts of things contribute to one's being. Some are matters of choice, others are not. But I guess understanding that being is important. Understanding how faith and the ethnic aspects of culture intersect.
She's on it quarter.
Sorry?
I knew you could say the right thing.
Sorry, trying to say something. Yeah. So these things intersect in ways that I guess one takes for granted. I guess the extent to which culture is truly ingrained is reflected perhaps in how little one thinks about it, which is why I'm struggling a little bit with this question. I think, and yeah, there's a personal security that comes from a spiritual identity or an ethnic identity, and that's why having the ancestors on the wall behind me as I speak and as I sit here at the desk and write and various things is really important as one aspect of that. But yeah, Brooke, what do you reckon?
Yeah, so for me it's a very similar answer to Auntie Kathy. My Aboriginality and my Christianity are one and the same. I think one of the things to understand, and Dominic talked about racism, but also the racism that exists in the church. We do have to name that as something that we face as Aboriginal peoples each and every day, and including in our theological colleges. And so it's taken a long time for Aboriginal Christian leaders to get a place in our theological colleges, and we've still got such a long way to go. But our understanding of the Creator, many Aboriginal Christian leaders say Genesis 1 is the greatest Aboriginal dreaming story ever told. And I think it's still for a lot of non-Indigenous Australian Christians to understand what that actually means. The Creator's story is embedded in the landscape. Not only do we acknowledge country each and every day with every footstep and the stolen land upon which we walk upon, but we are walking on the Creator's story. Over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples right across these lands now called Australia. I love how Bruce Pascoe in Dark Emu describes it as a jigsaw mutualism. Whilst you're responsible for your country, you also know the bigger picture. And that speaks to what I was saying earlier about needing to learn who we are as Aboriginal peoples, the communities, the lands, how that is integral to our identity and the Creator. You won't find one Aboriginal person who doesn't, Christian or non-Christian, who doesn't believe in the Creator. And to bring it back to a statistic for those who are into statistics, most Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, are Christian in Australia today. The last census was 54%, which is basically equivalent to the non-Indigenous population, which is 55%. But back in 2006, it was as high as 73% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples identified as Christian. And that's quite unique compared to other Indigenous groups around the world. And so we need to start looking at this uniqueness of these lands now called Australia. The Aboriginal peoples of these lands now called Australia is the world's oldest living continuing cultures. Let's really start to embrace that as the faith of knowing, being and doing, and all of those things put together. But the final point I just wanted to make on this question is, you know, it still fascinates me. I became an Aboriginal pastor in 2012. And so for me, that's the start of my Aboriginal Christian leadership journey. And over those last 8 years, the question I've been asked the most is, how can I be Aboriginal and be Christian? If I could take away that one question, because most of us are Christian, and it's often Christians asking it, and it's like, well, why is it only Aboriginal culture that's ever put under the microscope about how that can connect with being Christian? Because so many of us are Christian, and many of our great activists who fought for equality, citizenship, for justice over so many decades, it was their Aboriginality that drove them, but also their Christianity. They were people of faith. The William Coopers, Sir Pastor Doug Nichols, Mum Shirl, so many people. And if you don't know those three names, then I encourage you to go and learn these incredible Aboriginal Christian leaders and advocates, not just for Aboriginal peoples, but to bring healing to right across these lands now called Australia for all peoples.
Thank you. As has been mentioned a couple of times, today is Are You OK Day, which has a particular focus on mental well-being. I'm just wondering if panel members had any reflections on the connections between human rights for Indigenous people and mental well-being.
I think for me, listening to Dominic and thinking about the human rights side, as he was giving his talk this morning, I was thinking about family members who were impacted by the different policies and practices of the day throughout Australia. I think of my grandmother and mother who was forcibly moved, you know, to live on mission station. I think about my mother working for no wages. So I think about stolen generation. I think about stolen wages. All that she received was a garment, you know, either a shirt or a dress. You know, that was her payment in regards to working domestic servant. So for me, when you think about intergenerational, in this case trauma, people need to know that it still impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. And along with that goes a lot of losses. So, you know, for example, loss of language. Language is being revitalised in many countries, many with First Nations people. But there are a lot of other losses that go hand in hand with those things. So I think it's really important that we sit down and yarn and have conversations and listen to the untold stories. And as Brooke's already stated, the truth-telling needs to happen before we can actually start moving forward. We need to get a sense of exactly what it is that really happened in Australia, and we need to document it. Otherwise, it will be we'll just continue on the same path we are now. So that's one thing.
Thank you, Kathy. Dominic, do you have any?
Yeah, well, I suppose human rights are the basis to being okay. For both political and spiritual reasons, I think in terms of human rights stem from that original Christian idea of human creation in the image and likeness of God. And the idea of, you know, when you did what you do unto me, you do unto these, or least of our brethren, or the other way around, I think. But the point is important. In acknowledging and upholding the dignity of everybody, and in claiming our own dignity too. There's an immediate connection with that foundational Christian message, and that's really important, I think, in terms of being okay. Being okay in terms of, you know, basic material needs like clothing and housing and so on, but also being okay in terms of that broader right to culture, right to healthcare and education, and all those things that collectively come together and give us a definition of what okay means. The right to be who we are as persons created in the image and likeness of God is foundational to that question, are you okay?
Thank you, Dominic. Brooke, any thoughts?
Yeah, so to the question, if you're asking me the question, are you okay? The answer is no, I'm not. I live in an Australia where Aboriginal children are still locked up at the age of 10 years old. I live in an Australia where my peoples continue to die in custody, where when I was 11 years old in 1991 and we had the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, 339 recommendations and only a handful have ever been implemented. We are still denied medical attention when our people are in jail, and they are dying in jail in state-run systems. This is the reality. My people, as Stan Grant said, die too young and too often. The reality, our lived reality of the lack of closing the gap. And we can close the gap. We could have closed the gap already. But Aboriginal people's willpower and the uses of our resources to close that gap, we've exhausted ourselves doing that. It's time the other 97% of the population stepped up to the plate to actually do the work that needs to happen to close the gap. And yes, we've had these new targets released, but one of those targets was about the youth incarceration. The Attorney Generals of every state and territory met a few days before those new Closing the Gap targets were released. If they had done what Aboriginal people had prayed for and hoped for by raising the age of criminality from 10 years old to 14 years old, we could have immediately reduced youth incarceration by 17%. Not wait another year or 2 or 10, we could have immediately done it. And so the reality of racism, I think of the incredible work Beyond Blue did back in 2014 with their Stop, Think, Respect campaign. Their research that showed that 1 in 10 Australians would not employ an Aboriginal person, would not employ me. 1 in 4 would move seats on the bus if I was to sit next to them or another Aboriginal person. This is the reality of the Australia that we live in. And so Aboriginal people, we are not okay. But we are survivors. We have survived. And when you look at the true history of this land's now called Australia, that's a miracle. That's no one else's miracle but God's miracle. We are still here, and we are still here for a reason. We are survivors. We are resilient. We are adaptable. The world's oldest living continuing cultures. And so we are still here. We have forgiven. I still get surprised by how many people say, oh, Aboriginal people just need to forgive. I have to forgive each and every day as I walk across this stolen land, as I face the reality of racism. But our hand of friendship is extended to you. That's a core part of our cultures as Aboriginal peoples, of hospitality, generosity, of right relationship. And so we still seek right relationship. And so that invitation is still there to come alongside us and walk with us, not in front of us, not behind us, but side by side, and maybe even putting us on your shoulders and carrying us. And I believe that now is the time. I pray that now is the time.
Thank you, Brooke. I have a question from Monica. Monica writes, recently I was asked about what is my vision for 2020 and beyond. What excites you about the future for Indigenous peoples and the Church in Australia?
I think for me, I'm a little bit older than Brooke. I think people are willing to sit and have conversations. Churches are wanting to know. They're wanting to hear the stories. They're wanting to do better. I can see that and I hear it. And I think that excites me. I don't think it's going to be an easy way forward, but I can see things happening and things are improving. And that's really exciting for me. And also seeing Indigenous people rising up and becoming leaders and having a voice within society, within the broader church, whether it be Anglican or others. I think it is really exciting. I think that is something that I'm looking forward to and watching attentively, because I think that is exciting.
Okay. Dominic or Brooke?
Yeah, well, the Christian message, I suppose, is one of hope. And if there's no hope, then we've lost the point of faith, I suppose. I think, although the government is resisting things like the idea of a voice to Parliament, the Commonwealth certainly is resisting the idea of treaties. I don't think the arguments in favour of those two measures, for example, are going to go away. And I don't think people are going to stop prosecuting those arguments. And I do think in time we'll see some movement in direction. Certainly, I think in terms of a voice to Parliament. Maybe some time away, but I think it will happen. And I think that'll make a fundamental difference to the way politics is done. Nothing will be able to go before Parliament without being subject to independent and representative Indigenous scrutiny. And that doesn't mean Indigenous peoples will always win the argument, but it does mean that the argument will always be raised and always be held and always at least be considered. Because what happens when you speak to Parliament is you're speaking to Australia. And to have that opportunity for guaranteed public engagement whenever you think it's necessary is a very significant political authority. And from that, I think changes over time might occur for the better. Treaties, I think, are a little bit more problematic. And I think what's most problematic about treaties is that they require an Indigenous nation to recognise the legitimacy of the state. So what does the state have to do to earn that legitimacy, or to earn that capacity to be recognised? And for some people it may not be possible for that very high benchmark, that very high threshold to be met. And while as a people of hope, one imagines that there are strong Christian arguments for trying to pursue that, because treaties are ultimately instruments of reconciliation. But what happens if they can't be achieved, if the requirements for a fair and legitimate treaty just can't be met, either because the state doesn't want to do it, which is fairly likely, or because Indigenous nations say, well, this just doesn't meet our expectations of what the state needs to do, or how the state needs to function in a way that makes itself morally legitimate. It's just something that the state can't do, perhaps. But those are certainly not arguments against the conversations and the negotiations that people are having around the country, and Victoria and the Northern Territory, where governments have at least agreed to embark upon the process. But certainly the voice is something that I see happening much more quickly and having quite significant transformative effect.
Thank you, Dominic. Brooke, any thoughts?
Yeah, so 2020, how I've been describing it is, I feel like it's a moment where Australians have woken up, but I pray that we stay awake. So what excites me is that we're back at another wake-up moment, but we've had many wake-up moments. I thought our big wake-up moment was back in 2016 when we saw the footage of Dylan Voller, a boy, in a spit hood, restrained to a chair in a youth detention centre. But Australia fell back to sleep. We've woken up again in light of the global Black Lives Matter movement. But it took the death of an African-American man named George Floyd, who actually died on my 40th birthday, for Australia to wake up. Not the death of Tanya Day or David Dungay Jr. or Tane Chatfield or Miss Dew or, so many others over so many decades. And so I pray that we stay awake. And what excites me is I've seen Christians and non-Christians wanting to come on that journey to actually bring about justice. But we need to sustain that action. Aboriginal peoples have sustained it for 250 years. And so it means being intentional and staying on the journey with us. And so I feel like 2020, and amazing in the year 250 year anniversary since Cook's arrival in Sydney, is this the moment? I pray that it is the moment. And so, but the calls have been there for decade after decade. So my next practical step that I want us to see to do as a nation is a truth-telling commission on a national scale. And Auntie Jean Phillips and myself ran a truth-telling commission. So I have a model for Australia. Before we ran the first one, no media was interested in coming and documenting what we were doing. And we gathered 200 people together, and we did a truth-telling commission. I modelled it on the South African models and the Canadian models. And, I used to believe that treaty was the first step, that treaty was the only way we could come together to actually, is reconciliation the right word? Maybe not. Conciliation is still where we need to start, remembering the instructions from Arthur Phillip. To Arthur Phillip from the King, you are to conciliate the affections of the natives, showing them kindness and amity. And we're still waiting for that in 2020. Maybe people are waking up and starting to show that kindness and amity to start that conciliation. But treaty for me was the only way that we could come together as equal parties to sit at the negotiation table to work out how the relationship would work in this country. But as I've travelled around these lands now called Australia, I realise people don't understand that why we need a treaty. They don't even know that in 1988 with the Barunga Statement that treaty was promised, and we're still waiting for that treaty. And so by starting with the Truth-Telling Commission, and a 14-year-old a few years ago asked me, Brooke, how will we know when we've achieved reconciliation? And I said, it's when I can stop telling the true history of Australia, because every single Australian knows it in their mind and in their heart and in their being. And so a Truth-Telling Commission is where we can start. I can show anyone that wants a model. I've got a model. And so let's really start the work. So I'm hoping we've had so many first steps. Dominic talked about some of those steps, like saying sorry, the apology to the stolen generations. That's only one apology. And we keep having these first steps. But I say, when do we have our second and our third and our fourth step and actually start running? And I pray that 2020 is the year that we start running together.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Kathy and Dominic and Brooke, on behalf of all of us, for adding the vital voice of lived experience to our time together today. And maybe while we're running, you people can either use the clap emoticon or express their appreciation in some other way. Thank you so much.
Mark, can I just give the
yes, you certainly can.
This book, promote this book for the Aboriginal Evangelical Fellowship of Australia. If you want to know some of the history and stories told, untold stories from Aboriginal Christians throughout Australia and how it was in the early days, but also some of their testimonials and some of the theology, I'd like to promote that book. You can get it from Coorong. It's a celebration of God's faithfulness. So the AEF movement has been going for 50 years. So get a hold of it and have a read. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Great book. A celebration of God's faithfulness. Certainly, if you go to coorong.com.au, I think, and search for it, you'll be able to purchase it online. Let me pray. Gracious and loving God, I thank you for Kathy and Dominic and Brooke. Thank you for their willingness to share with us today. Help us to reflect on their words, that where appropriate, you might work in and through us to bring about the fruits in keeping with repentance. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
And now come to our second panel. So at this point, I'm going to invite everyone apart from Janet, Jenny and Karen to hide their videos, and Janet, Jenny and Karen to switch their video on. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'm just getting you all back. There we go. Terrific. We have three panel members who are going to help us engage once again with the presentations. I'm going to introduce them each in turn. Firstly, we have Janet McKidney. Well, welcome, Janet. Janet is the chair of the Embracing Ministries Committee. Embracing Ministries is a ministry of the Anglican Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn that engages with families whose lives are impacted by disability in some way. Welcome, Janet. Is there anything you'd like to say to introduce yourself?
As you probably can work out from the background, I am presently at the coming up 14 months of being in hospital at the moment in the University of Canberra Rehab Hospital. I'd had a fall 14 months ago on top of some genetic issues with my joints and muscles, and I'm now unable to wait there, so I'm fully using a wheelchair. And tomorrow is my NDIS meeting, and hopefully I'll be able to leave before too long. That
would be wonderful. We'll be praying about that. Thank you, Janet. Yes. Secondly, we have Jenny Wright. Jenny Wright is a newsreader with 1RPH, that stands for Radio Print Handicapped, a radio station here in Canberra, particularly that serves people who are vision impaired in some way. Welcome, Jenny. Is there anything you'd like to say to introduce yourself?
Oh, good morning. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I've just got a few things written down, if that's okay. Just
Of course.
talk a bit about myself. And the foundation of my hidden disability is osteoporosis, broken bones, osteoarthritis in all joints, degeneration throughout the spine, which in turn causes constant pain and leads on to fatigue. And I liken it to a train journey. The pain pulls in at one station, it stays for a while, then it moves on. And it's exciting, you never know where it's going to stop. I was widowed at 39. My precious son was 4. My focus was to make sure he knew he was loved, safe and looked after. He's now 38, Christian and an amazing person. Throughout the years and many situations later, depression reared its ugly head. And in 2007, at the age of 60, my life in every way came to a complete stop. Unable to cope due to a total collapse of the body, fractured back, cracked tailbone, a complete nervous breakdown occurred, and the only way to recovery was to be admitted to a mental rehab hospital. At the time, when I entered, if I can just read this little bit from, I did write a journal of my unexpected journey, and just to maybe explain it a little bit more, this is how I felt when I was admitted. A rusty key to unlock the doors in the recess of my mind, a cupboard where the door is so tightly closed, sealed up, and as the key turns with sheer willpower, a door begins to open. I enter into a very deep, dark recess filled with cobwebs, a never-ending image of twists and turns around corners, stirring up deeply embedded thoughts and feelings, scary, not wanting to surface to face demons, but it must be done. And being unable to cope due to the total collapse of the body, with a fractured back and cracked tailbone, and a culmination of situation of the years, the complete nervous breakdown occurred, and the only way to recovery was to be hospitalised. My mind was in total despair, confusion and fog, and I didn't know what was ahead. Would there be a light at the end of a very dark tunnel? And I was terrified I'd never be able to leave or get out of the unit. I was unable to get out of bed. Where am I? My body did not feel as though it belonged to me. They were constantly giving me pills to relax me, to help me sleep, help with the pain, feeling so alone and abandoned. I was so lost and had no purpose anymore. Didn't know what was going to happen to me, and what brought me to that place of darkness. The love and care I got in the rehab was wonderful, and it was the start of a very, very long journey back. Yet, through it all, in my deepest, darkest places, there's one person who always walked with me and has never left me. He is my rock. He upholds me with an everlasting love. He listens to my cries for help. He dries my tears. He comforts me and just loves me. And this wonderful person is Jesus. Even with my faith and deep trust in the Lord, it certainly isn't easy going through so many challenges. But without the Lord's love and strength, it would be so much harder, and I'm continuing to grow stronger in him each day. And it is so much better to go through hard times with Jesus than without him. My prayer is that if all my many, many experiences can be used to help and encourage someone who is struggling and to glorify God, that is all that matters. And I know that God, even though I live alone, I know that God is my companion. And as we've heard, today is Are You OK Day. If you know someone who is struggling, please just be there for them. Having someone to just listen to you can make a life-changing difference. I didn't have that. The world can see a face that looks fine, seems to be in control, but inside it is breaking down, falling apart and disintegrating. And the scary part is you don't necessarily realize it or understand why. Depression and mental health is a very real hidden disability. Please don't be ashamed or embarrassed about it and reach out for help.
Thank you, Jenny. And our third panel member is Karen King. Karen King is a member of the Anglican Church, a public servant, a clergy spouse. Welcome, Karen. Anything else you'd like to say to introduce yourself?
Just want to thank the previous two people. They did a really great job. I hope I can live up to that. I have a visual disability. Probably started about 20 years ago. It's slow, it's degenerative, so it's slowly getting worse. I say it probably started 10 years ago. It's a very rare version of visual disability, so it doesn't behave like most others. And it was probably only diagnosed about 10 years ago. So I had 10 years there of trying to work out why I saw things differently to everyone else, or as I like to say, everyone else saw things differently to me. My world was fine, but everyone else saw things a bit strange. But I've had to learn to adjust from living, I guess, in one, I'm just sort of thinking this through, from being normal, if you know what normal is, to not, and the reactions you get from people, as well as just adjusting to how you do things day to day. I still work full time. I have lots of aides to help me do that, to help me see my screen at work. I've changed careers so that I can actually work more in an office-based job than out in the fields. But yeah, I have learned an awful lot from this experience, and I wouldn't swap it for the world. It's been tough, it's been hard, but from what I've learned, I wouldn't swap it. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. Once again, if attendees have any questions that they'd like me to direct to members of the panel, particularly about Christianity and disability, you can type those questions into the chat function. I wonder if we kick off by asking the same question I asked the other panel. That is, are there any aspects of the presentations that you'd particularly like to comment on?
Well, I'd like just to comment on what Monica said, with her example of isolation when she used the birds as an example, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, because isolation is just a very big part of having a disability, for want of a better word. Mine is a hidden disability, so no one can see what's going on inside me. And living alone is a big challenge, especially in this time now with this COVID-19 going on. I may live alone, but obviously God is my companion. But for me, belonging is very, very important. And I've been, like, I was 50 before I came to Christ, and so I thought I was sort of doing okay. Once I turned 15, came to Christ, everything fell apart, and this is when all this other stuff happened. Yet deep down, deep within me, I knew there was someone that was with me, taking care of me. And belonging, since coming over to Canberra, to belong to the right, loving family church, for me personally, is so, so important. And that has encouraged me and given me support. And I'm growing more and more in God. I'm a constant and forever work in progress. You go up and you go back a few steps. But I thought that example was so true, that you can be out on the outer looking in and seeing all these people belonging to something, and it's a horrible feeling when you don't belong to something. Yes, I've got a son and everything, but they've got their life. I still had to find my own life. And as it was mentioned earlier, that the learning and growing experience from what we go through, and literally hanging on by the fingernails to Christ sometimes. Yeah, it's a constant daily challenge, learning program, and it is a battlefield of the mind. That's what I found. Yeah, so thank you, Monica, for that example. For me, it really touched a part of me.
I found the identification with your concept of that person-centeredness in service provision. When I first accessed the NDIS, we were still in the trial period here in Canberra, but I had to do a lot of research and found articles online about person-centeredness, and realised that the program was set up based on a person-centered program way of doing things. And it was a lot of work, and I have 2 degrees. I sort of think a lot of people who are using the NDIS simply don't have the capacity to present it and in the way that and so it sort of is leaving people out. I think also the person-centeredness personally, to recognise that this is the standard of care that is expected to be given today, particularly in government facilities, and to leave that expectation out there. I've only in the last couple of days stood up for another person who was not being treated in a person-centeredness approach, and I went to an appropriate person and reported it and said, this is not appropriate. It was being very much treated as infantile for an elderly woman and that sort of thing. And so I think from the point of view of disability, to understand what that means in how people should be treating you, not to be demanding or abusive in it, but just to present it in a logical way. And I think it has I found it has quite a positive response.
Thank you, Janet.
I'd just like to add there that I guess I'm going to just summarise what I've got out of both the talks and the previous panel and the bit of this panel so far. Is it is obvious, but we're all people. We all identify as people. We all identify for who we are, for what's made us who we are. And I guess for me, the penny kind of dropped that part of my journey with disability has been changing identity, in that I didn't have it for quite a few years and then did have it. And it's learning to live with that change and that identity of who I am and how people treat you for that label you might have. One time I was out there trying to be compassionate to people with disability or who had other things going on, did my best, probably didn't do a particularly good job, and then all of a sudden you're placed on the other side and trying to be the person on the other side, to embrace people who want to care, but also to be an advocate of what is appropriate care. I just think, that's been really important. We're all people, and community is so important just to understand who we all are.
Yeah, I see there's a question from Monica about practice, policy, etc., about being a Christian living with a disability. When I was in the mental rehab unit, I was there for 7 weeks, and I had this lovely psychologist lady. She was lovely, and she really took me under her wing, and you can imagine being like a lump of jelly, blubbering on as you do. And she did a role reversal this particular meeting, and I hate role reversals. I hate trying to be somebody else. And anyway, she sat there trying to be me, trying to cry, which didn't really work. And she just asked me one question, like the question I would have asked her. What should I do? What am I supposed to do? And my first answer, without any hesitation, was pray. And she just looked at me and smiled and said very quietly, you know what to do. Now, she wasn't a Christian. She believed in something in the universe. She would go out and just lay it and look at the stars and stuff. But that was the first place in that mental rehab where my faith was recognised, where God worked in me and through me. He did bring one particular lady to Christ. That was an amazing experience. And also I got the nickname Charlie Chaplin because I had to go from being bedridden to the wheelchair, etc., all those steps. And apparently when I got to walking with the stick, practicing up and down the passageway, apparently I walked like Charlie Chaplin. So I got the nickname Charlie Chaplin. And going into the dining area one day, there was this young man, I'll call him a young man, obviously. He was, to look at him in the street, I probably would have crossed over because he was big and all the rest of it. And he stood up and he put out his hands like this and he said, right, quiet everybody, behave yourselves. The chaplains arrived. And I don't know how he even knew I was a Christian because it's not something you go around talking about. But that was the beginning of I think acknowledgement in a medical service for me, as a Christian, because when I was actually admitted to the rehab, I had to jump through so many hoops, which you obviously do, but I couldn't understand why, because I couldn't even talk straight, couldn't stand, couldn't walk. So that was, for me, that lady psychologist was an amazing turning point for me, shall we say. And yes, some professions do recognise it and some don't. So that was my experience.
Jenny, my response to that is I have a psychologist I'm seeing regularly at the moment. I went through a couple of weeks ago some pretty heavy depression times. And the last time we got together about to talk, she says, Janet, just before you start, would you like to pray? Because I know it's important to you.
Oh, awesome.
And so she just asked me, would I like to pray for this time that we were talking together? And I found that so affirming of understanding me, but also giving me that opportunity.
Oh, brilliant. That's great. Yeah. I don't know if I actually got to pray for her, but, you know, just her reaction was so lovely. It really was so lovely. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I used to go down into the chapel and pray with people, which was really nice in the hospital.
For those who haven't can't see the chat box, the question that Monica asked was, what do you wish services, practice policy, politics, knew about being a Christian and living with disabilities? Any other thoughts on how service providers can acknowledge the faith of people living with a disability?
I think one of the areas that comes up in presenting how my faith has helped me with my disability is that faith and faith practices work such hand in hand with many of the mental health and other rehabilitation services. And I'm thinking of things like mindfulness, the distraction, the sense of belonging, the sense of being able to accept the situation you're in with acceptance therapy and things like that. And that it's not contraindicated in the services they can provide, certainly and within mental health. It can so much complement and make it even greater value.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think for me, the experience is that you know, Jesus says, take your burden, I'll take your burden and make it light for you. That you really are moving forward. You do have your glum times and your down times, but generally you're moving forward because you've got someone beside you helping you, and you know you get pushed to the level that you can't cope. You know that you only get pushed as far as you can cope. So, you know, you've got someone there to help you the whole time. And I think sometimes service providers don't come expecting that kind of attitude, that you just want to move on and get things done, because you do have spiritual help, you do have other help, rather than just, you know, they're just ticking boxes to say what they're doing, that there's actually this extra being, this extra power, this spiritual power that's going on. I think sometimes takes them by surprise.
No, that's true. And yeah, acknowledging your limitations, that's been a hard one. I mean, at 73 and I've had to acknowledge that I'm not 21 anymore and do the things I could do, and changing your thinking. And I don't know about you girls, but waking up in the morning, that first thoughts of the day, sometimes that's the hardest time, and you've got to, for me, to turn your thinking around and not think of, oh gosh, you know, wouldn't it be nice if someone could just make a cup of tea and bring it to me for a change? But yeah, it's a mindset, and sometimes that mindset is just, I used to sit, when I first did my fracture in my back, I was at home, they sent me home, there's nothing they could do for me, so they reckon. I said, well, I'm going home, empty house, I live on my own. Oh well, you know, off you go. So I was in the house for 6 weeks, bedridden, and I used to listen to a lot of Joyce Meyer at the time, and I would lay on that bed with my Bible and stuff. I was a pretty young Christian. I was 60 and 63, and I would cry. I suppose, like probably all of us do. You cry and you speaking out your scriptures, and you're just going for it. And when I could eventually get out of that bed and kind of stand up, I actually physically stood on the Bible, and I gave it back to God, and my staff then was a broom handle with Psalm 23 written on it. That got me around the house. So, yeah, God is good, is all I can say. He is so good.
Just to, as a final question, any further reflections on how your faith has built your capacity as a person living with disability?
Yeah, capacity building is again one of those key terms that's used in providing services to people with disability. And so when I was thinking about it there, thinking what has it done, I've probably got two areas I'd like to talk about on that, is the ability to give you resilience, or it gives for both pain and things like mental health, depression and things like that. The faith has been great. And again, doing a lot of the things that has been coming up in service models. Mindfulness, as I said before, is an extremely powerful form of therapy. And when it's Christ that you're going to talk to, and you go into that, and you're there, and the presence of God is with you, there's that added spiritual dimension that gives you not only in a physical sense, but also a spiritual sense. And we are such integrated beings that the spirit and the soul and the body all interact, and the prayer it is really good. I find that the pain and the depression that I struck. And the other one is just prayer. And it's not just prayer, is it? It's prayer for when I'm in the dark times and you're just lying on the bed and just crying, but yet being able to talk to God and to be able to share those things out. At UCH, we have Mark, I can't think of the word, labyrinth. And that has been wonderful for me. There are times I'll just get on that labyrinth, and each time I make a curve, we talk to God about something else, and we can talk around, and just following that around and getting to the centre where Christ is. I mean, that's how it feels when I get into the centre. I come right into that presence with Christ. It has been wonderful. But not only that, when I was needing to leave TCH to come across here, I'd actually called in a few of my friends, including Mark and Monica and my own local parish priest, and to do the service of healing and the strengthening that gave. And interesting, the respect I felt when I just said to the ward, this is what I want to happen at this time. And they delayed my ambulance to bring me over here because I wanted to do this. And yeah, that was capacity building in a lot of ways.
You're amazing. You really are. You're amazing. And when I get into that spot, I think, well, hang on. Jesus went through all of this for me, so he suffered more than I suffered.
Yes.
So hang on, he's walking with me. Someone said to me once when they were going through some stuff, well, if your God is so good, where is he? And I remember saying, well, he's in the same place he was when his son was crucified. He's walking with you all the way.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly that sense of what I think Corinthians refers to being in the fellowship of Christ with the sufferings, that there's a real sense of identification that he can provide for you at the time of pain when all you can do is just keep breathing and hope you get through the next 5 minutes, and the next 5 minutes, and of course it takes another 5 minutes before the endone kicks in. But just knowing that Christ suffered for me, and felt the pain as well. And this identification is really powerful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if he suffered, then what right do we have to complain sometimes?
You're always allowed to admit the reality where you're at.
True.
No denials.
I think for me, gaining a disability later in life has strengthened my faith. I think before I started having problems with my vision and needing to depend on others more, I was really quite an independent person. I like to achieve things on my own. And I've had to really turn that around and sort of get people to read things out to me so I know what I'm doing, or get the right tin out of the cupboard or whatever, so I cook the right thing and don't mix up the wrong bits of pieces. I need help at work constantly. I've had to become much more dependent on people and much more dependent on Christian faith community. So I've got to see Christ alive in other people probably a lot more than I would have if I'd stayed being an independent.
Oh, that's true.
Believing kind of person. I just want to just share a story that I think really hit it home with me. Is a couple of years ago we visited friends interstate, and they went to a pretty vibrant, active church. We'd had a pretty tough few months and just wanted to quietly reflect, so we politely declined to go to their jumpy, bouncy church and found the local Anglican church that was offering just a normal, traditional, quiet, reflective service. So we went to that. We were welcomed at the door really well. And their hymn book was one that we used regularly at our church at the time, and I knew it came in large print. So we just made the general inquiry, do you have large print service sheets, because the service was on a sheet, and large print hymn books? And they were, oh no, sorry, hadn't thought of that. And they were very apologetic and tried to find things to do to help, which was really nice. It was just sort of that extra stretch out to help. And they offered that if we came again the following week, they'd make sure they had it. And we said, oh, we're just down for the week visiting, we're interstate, so we won't be back for the following week. We went back a year later because we went and visited the same relatives. And when we walked in the door, they had half a dozen large print song books, half a dozen or more large print service sheets. And just that little interaction had made them really think about loving their neighbour and loving Christ, and how they could help other people who turned up at their church. So it was now a regular pattern for them to have large print service sheets, large print books, and other aids for other disabilities. It really made them think. And they said it was really an eye-opener for them, because a number of their older congregation people, once they started having large print, sort of spoke up and said, well, I haven't been able to read the normal print for years, so it's really nice to be included again. And it was much more of an inclusive kind of story. And that was really warming, that just asking that simple question had made such a big difference to so many people. And I think really in our church communities, we need to just sort of think outside the box sometimes of just those little tiny things that make such a big difference. Mm. And I do remember coming back and at another church where there were steps everywhere, sort of making a comment, I'm not in a wheelchair, but maybe it would be nice to have ramps and things so that people in wheelchairs could come, because I knew of a few people who wanted to come and couldn't because there was no ramps. And someone off the cuff of it, just probably without thinking, said, oh, we don't have anyone who needs stuff like that, so why bother? And even though I'm not in a wheelchair, that hit really hard, because it was kind of saying we don't want people who are different. And I think sometimes it's useful for all of us to think how we present ourselves. Do we present by taking it and getting large print service books, or do we take it by just saying they're too hard, we don't want to be bothered? It does make a big difference. So I just thought I'd share that, because that's really where I think, you know, my faith is strengthened, is really acknowledging everyone for who they are and loving them for who they are. I said I tried to do that before, but I think I really understand that a lot more now. Having been not disabled and then disabled, I understand what that means a lot more, and how hurtful just off-the-cuff comments can be, or very small things can make such a really big difference.
Yeah, you're hitting some of my passions there, Karen. I started doing some units at St Mark's at the Theological College, and with some saying to the Lord, you know, my age in life and with the capacity, what is it that I can still do? And the one that has come up, particularly when I did the unit on ecclesiology, was very much working with churches in helping them to be inclusive. And so, yes, one of my little passions will be to encourage churches to think beyond ramps and disabled toilets, but, you know, places for people with disabilities to genuinely be part of that worship, and to be able to go and receive Eucharist, to be able to, as the church I go at Charnwood, that I can actually go and do the prayers of the people up the front, and that to be set up for doing that as well. Because, you know, we have a disability, but we still have gifts and spirituality that we want to offer to others as well.
So true.
Thank you, Jenny, Janet and Karen, for sharing some personal stories, some profound insights to help us engage with some really vital issues. I'm going to pray for you, giving thanks, and on behalf of everyone here. Loving and gracious God, I thank you so much for Janet and Jenny and Karen, for their lived experience, their wisdom, their grace and their courage. Lord, please help us as a society, as churches, to be communities of welcome and inclusion that embrace the gifts that all people bring. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Mark, please may I just ask if people would pray for me. I had a red rash come on my leg last night. It has grown, and they now believe it's cellulitis, which is quite a dangerous thing in my condition. I'm about to have to start some treatment for that. The doctor came in and gave the diagnosis while I've been sitting here.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll do that now. Loving and gracious God, we do pray for Janet's leg. We pray that through your work, through the work of those who care for her, you'll bring healing and recovery in Jesus' name. Amen. We're now going to hear from two more of our partners. One is, well, from me, as I've said earlier, my name is Mark Short, and I'm Bishop of the Anglican Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn. The Anglican Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn includes the ACT, the south coast from Bateman's Bay to the Victorian border, and inland, encompassing areas such as Wagga, Young, Tumut and Tumbarumba. At the centre, we gather here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, but we also gather on the lands of the Yuin and Wiradjuri and other peoples. We incorporate 60 parishes and ministry units, including embracing ministries, 8 schools, the vital work of Anglicare and many other ministries. We believe our call is to engage a world of difference with the love and the truth of Jesus. In our words and our actions, reflecting something of Christ's inclusive love for the world. And hence, this seminar today fits very well into the heart of that vision. Our prayer is that we might continue to be and become a more inclusive and welcoming community where people from all cultural backgrounds and lived experiences can encounter the good news of Jesus and take their part in serving the church and the world. So it's an absolute blessing for me and for us to partner in this seminar today. Also going to hear now from, once again, from Jenny from Radio 1 RPH. Yes, yes, over to you, Jenny.
Okay. Radio 1 RPH informs and entertains listeners across the Canberra, Wagga Wagga and Juni regions by turning print into sound. And each day our volunteers read from the major daily newspapers, including the Canberra Times, and from popular international and Australian magazines, journals, serialised books and community newsletters. We also feature readings from the Daily Advertiser and the Southern Cross for our Wagga Wagga and Juni listeners. My name is Jenny Wright, and as a volunteer, once a fortnight I read and record articles from the Australian, UK and international Guardian newspapers. I also prepare a series called Heartwarming for Sandra, the presenter, to read on a weekly basis, and until COVID-19 started, I would once a month from the station read live for the programme Christian Perspectives on a Sunday afternoon. We've also begun a new series called Living with Disabilities. It is a 15-minute weekly programme with Monica Short and myself, and the first programme begins on Monday the 14th of September at 9:15 a.m. and it's repeated at 8 p.m. on Monday evening. If you have difficulty reading printed material or just want to stay informed in these fast-paced times while enjoying a range of entertaining programmes, then Radio 1RPH is for you. Tune in and find out what's happening in your community, across the nation and around the world. You can find it on 11:25 AM Canberra, 89.5 FM Wagga and 99.5 FM in Juni. You can also stream it on the internet if you visit www.radio1rph.org.au for more details. And thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Radio 1RPH. We're now going to return to Associate Professor Dominic O'Sullivan and Lecturer Monica Short for some concluding comments.
Well, Dominic, that was amazing.
Yes, it was a very interesting, well, almost 3 hours now. So, yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody for their participation and for those who shared their experiences and insights. I think, you know, that's profoundly useful for the rest of us. So thank you, and I understand this is being recorded for training purposes by various people, and you know, I would imagine there's an awful lot that people will get out of this. Coming back to that foundational point I made earlier about human creation and the image and likeness of God being, I guess, the reason for a Christian interest in human rights, the reason for how we think about upholding the dignity, the inviolable dignity of the human person is really important. And I think from the perspectives we've heard today, hopefully there are some really good insights provided into how that might happen, what that means in practice for people, what that means in terms of how and why public policies are formed as they are, how and why churches engage with people, and so on. There's an enormous amount for people to think about from the discussions today. So I hope people have enjoyed the event and look forward to doing something similar again, perhaps in Social Sciences Week next year.
I too absolutely enjoyed the event, and as a social worker, I kept thinking about, particularly reflecting on my past practice and my involvement with different suggestions to do with policies and stuff. And I kept thinking about what I would do differently if I had that time again, now that I've heard people speaking. And I think particularly that idea that yes, services are really, really important, but people need more than a bureaucracy. They really need their faith being respected, the essence of who they are being respected. And I just absolutely loved every moment of people talking about, you know, how we need to, like you were saying, Dominic, remember who that person is and give dignity and respect and uphold people for who they are. And yeah, so can I just say thank you to everybody who's been involved today. Thank you very much to our partners, to Embracing Ministries, and unfortunately the person who inspired today isn't here with us, Andrea, but thank you to Embracing Ministries and Andrea for suggesting we actually do this. And it kind of grew out of there and became bigger and bigger as we went along. Thank you to Social Science Week and everyone who organises Social Science Week. Thank you to 1RPH, Common Grace, Anglicare New South Wales West, ACT, Anglicare Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn, and the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, and also Charles Sturt University. You've all been wonderful partners. We feel very honoured to have worked with you. Thank you to everybody who's participated in some way, to our chairs, to the panel members, to my fellow colleague Dominic. Without you, this event wouldn't have happened. And thank you to everybody who turned up and listened. You are all outstanding. Thank you. God bless. And I'll hand over to Mark and Stephen to finish us off.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Monica. It's been a rich feast of mutual learning. We've been stretched intellectually, and we've also, I think all of us, been moved emotionally as we've encountered the real life experience of those who've shared with us. In a little while, I'll say a concluding prayer, but Stephen, are you still with us? Is there anything in particular you'd like to say as we come to an end? Let me pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this time spent with each other in a virtual world. We thank you for the perspectives and stories we've heard. Help us to treasure and reflect on them well, that we might, in our lives and in our commitments, reflect something of your love for the world you've made. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you once again. Yes, it's been a blessing to share this journey with you.